The delivery room buzzed with the quiet hum of machines and the soft shuffling of nurses. Sarah Turner cradled her newborn sons in her arms, sweat clinging to her forehead but a smile spread across her lips. 3 perfect boys, Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah, lay nestled against her chest, their tiny fists opening and closing as if reaching for her love. "You did amazing, honey," Sarah whispered to them, stroking their soft curls. Her heart swelled with joy. This was supposed to be the happiest moment of her life. But everything shattered when David stepped closer. The doctor had just finished wrapping the babies in blankets when David's smile faltered. His hand, which had hovered above one baby's head to caress him, froze mid-air. "What is this?" His voice was low, but the undercurrent of confusion and fear was unmistakable. Sarah frowned, tilting her head. "What do you mean? These are our babies, David." David's eyes darted from one baby to the next, panic dawning in his expression. He stepped back as if the children were strangers. No, Sarah, what the hell is going on here? What are you talking about?" Sarah's voice trembled, her heart quickening. David's jaw clenched, and his eyes darkened as he glared down at the 3 tiny boys bundled before him. They're not white." The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face. "What? Look at them," David hissed. "They have dark skin. They're black." The room seemed to tilt, spinning beneath Sarah's feet. She stared down at her sons, beautiful with their mocha-toned skin and dark curly hair. Her hands trembled as the warmth in her heart was replaced with icy fear. "I don't know. Genetics can be strange," Sarah stammered, desperately trying to make sense of the moment. "Maybe someone in our family—" "Don't!" David cut her off. "You think I'm stupid? You cheated, Sarah." His voice was sharp with rage, and his blue eyes burned with betrayal. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "No, David, I didn't. I swear on everything, David didn't let her finish. He ripped his hand through his hair, pacing frantically. "How could you do this to me? To us? These aren't my children." The words rang in Sarah's ears, each syllable more painful than the last. "They are yours," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear to you, David." David shook his head, stepping back toward the door. "I can't do this. I won't." "David, please." Sarah reached for him, but he jerked away from her touch as if burned. The nurse, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, shifted on her feet. "Maybe you two need a moment alone." "No," David growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I've had enough." He shot one final bitter look at Sarah. "I want a divorce." With those words, David turned and stormed out, leaving Sarah alone in the hospital room with 3 tiny boys and a heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Creating 90,000 words in one go is a huge task. I'll now flesh out the next chapters in detail to help you continue the momentum. I'll break down chapters 2 to 5 in full narrative form to maintain the story's tone. We'll build on the emotional hook and suspense, keeping the pacing brisk to capture the reader's attention. Sarah sat alone in the hospital room, the weight of the silence pressing down on her. The cries of the triplets filled the space, but David's absence loomed larger than any sound. Nurses came and went, but none could fix the aching emptiness in her chest. She looked down at her babies, Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah, and promised herself she would raise them no matter what. She traced their small faces with her fingertips, whispering words of love through her tears. The fear of what lay ahead gnawed at her, but she knew she had no choice. "David isn't coming back," she thought bitterly. "I have to do this alone." A nurse stepped into the room, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. "Mrs. Turner, your discharge papers are ready." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She gathered the triplets in their blankets and braced herself to leave the hospital and step into the unknown. When Sarah arrived home, reality hit her with the force of a freight train. The crib David had built sat unfinished in the nursery. Half the house was empty. He must have packed up his things while she was at the hospital. A note lay on the kitchen table, scrawled hastily in David's handwriting. "I'll be back to get the rest. Good luck." Sarah crumpled the note in her fist, rage bubbling under the surface. "Good luck?" That's all he had to say after abandoning her and their children. She carried the babies to the couch, her body aching from exhaustion. Elijah began to wail, his tiny fists shaking in the air, and soon Isaiah and Noah followed. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as the overwhelming weight of single motherhood hit her for the first time. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I'm here. I've got you." The baby's cries echoed through the house, making it painfully clear. David was gone. It was just the four of them now. The first few weeks after the triplets were born were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. But it wasn't just the demands of motherhood that wore Sarah down. It was the whispers. Small-town gossip spread like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion about her situation. When Sarah took the boys to the grocery store for the first time, the stares began almost immediately. She could feel eyes on her as she pushed the stroller down the aisles, murmurs following her like a shadow. "Did you hear? David left her, says the babies aren't his." Poor man, she must have cheated on him. Look at them. Those kids are definitely not his. Sarah clenched her jaw, keeping her head high as she grabbed a carton of milk. Ignore them. Just ignore them, she told herself. But the words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. At the checkout, the cashier gave her a sympathetic smile. "You doing okay, sweetie?" Sarah forced a nod. "Just tired," she lied. The cashier leaned in conspiratorially. "You hang in there, hun. You know my cousin went through the same thing. Husband up and left when she had a baby that didn't look like him." Sarah stiffened. "They're David's," she said firmly, though she wasn't sure why she bothered. No one believed her. The cashier gave a pitying smile as if to say, "Whatever you need to tell yourself, sweetheart." Sarah left the store with tears stinging her eyes. The triplets squirmed in their stroller, oblivious to the judgment swirling around them. But Sarah knew she couldn't escape it, not in this town. Everywhere she went, people would look at her children and see a scandal. Back at home, Sarah found herself teetering on the edge of exhaustion. The triplets' cries were constant, and sleep was a distant memory. Her phone rang occasionally, well-meaning friends offering condolences or curious neighbors fishing for gossip, but the one person she longed to hear from never called. Late one night, after the triplets had finally fallen asleep, Sarah sat on the floor of the nursery, her back against the wall. The weight of everything, David's betrayal, the town's judgment, the endless demands of motherhood, pressed down on her until she felt like she couldn't breathe. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, the sound muffled by the dark, empty house. "I can't do this," she whispered to no one. "I can't." But even as the words escaped her, a flicker of determination sparked in her chest. "You don't have a choice," she reminded herself. "They need you." The next morning, she forced herself out of bed, fueled by coffee and sheer willpower. She dressed the boys, changed their diapers, and packed them into the stroller. They were too young to understand, but Sarah knew one thing. If she was going to survive, she had to keep moving, one day at a time. Weeks turned into months, and life became a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and exhaustion. Sarah's world had shrunk to the size of her living room, the nursery, and the occasional trip to the grocery store. But one thing gnawed at her day and night: the DNA test. She had taken the test on a whim, desperate to prove to herself and the world that the triplets were David's. When the results came back, she had opened the envelope with trembling hands, her heart pounding in her chest. Paternity confirmed, 99.9% match. The relief that washed over her was quickly replaced by bitterness. David was their father. There was no doubt, but he had abandoned them anyway. Knowing the truth only made the betrayal sting more. Sarah folded the results neatly and tucked them into the bottom drawer of her dresser, hidden beneath a stack of old sweaters. She didn't want to see them. What good was the truth if it didn't change anything? One evening, as she rocked Noah to sleep, Elijah toddled over and tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy?" he asked, his big brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Where's Daddy?" The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She blinked back tears and forced a smile. "Daddy's not here right now, sweetheart." Elijah tilted his head. "But why?" Sarah kissed the top of his head, holding him close. "I don't know, baby," she whispered. "I don't know." In the quiet of the night, after the boys were asleep, Sarah stood in front of the dresser, her hand hovering over the bottom drawer. She knew she could confront David with the DNA results. She could force him to acknowledge the boys. But what if it didn't matter? What if David still didn't care? Sarah let out a shaky breath and closed the drawer without opening it. Some truths were too painful to face. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitor, a rare moment of peace that Sarah cherished. She sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The boys were finally napping. As exhausted as she was, she couldn't stop her mind from wandering back to the hidden DNA results. The paper weighed heavy in her thoughts, a truth she both wanted to forget and couldn't bear to confront. What good was the truth if David still refused to care? She shook the thought away and rubbed her eyes. Survival came first, one day at a time. While Sarah stared out the window, the triplets, now toddlers, woke from their nap. Elijah, the most curious of the three, toddled into the bedroom Sarah rarely entered, her old master bedroom, the room she used to share with David. He stood on his tiptoes, his tiny fingers barely able to reach the handle of the bottom drawer. With a determined grunt, he tugged it open. Inside were sweaters folded neatly, but something else caught his eye. A white envelope. He reached for it, his little hands clutching the paper. "Isaiah! Noah!" Elijah whispered loudly. His brothers came toddling in, their eyes wide with curiosity. Elijah held up the folded paper like it was a treasure map. "What's that?" Isaiah asked. "Dunno, but it has Mommy's name on it," Elijah replied with excitement. He carefully unfolded the document, even though he couldn't read the words. He stared at the black and white print, his small hands smoothing the crinkled edges. They were too young to understand the significance of the words. Paternity confirmed, 99.9% match. But something about it made Elijah's little heart race. "Mommy's hiding it," Elijah whispered, sensing that the paper was important, even though he didn't fully understand why. Later that day, Sarah walked into the room and found the boys sitting quietly on the floor, the crumpled DNA report between them. Her heart dropped to her stomach. "Elijah!" she gasped, snatching the paper from his tiny hands. "Where did you get this?" He pointed to the drawer without hesitation. "Found it." Sarah's breath hitched. She folded the paper again, hands shaking, and stuffed it into her pocket. It was only a matter of time, she thought grimly. They were bound to ask sooner or later. "Mommy?" Isaiah's voice was small and uncertain. "What does it say?" Sarah knelt in front of them, her heart heavy. She knew she couldn't hide the truth forever. But how do you explain something so complicated to children so young? "It's something about your dad," she said softly, brushing their hair away from their faces. Elijah's eyes brightened. "Daddy? Where is he? Why doesn't he come here?" Sarah felt the familiar sting of tears, but she blinked them back. "Daddy? He doesn't live here anymore, sweetheart." "Why not?" Noah asked innocently. "Did we do something bad?" The question broke Sarah's heart in two. She pulled all three boys into a tight hug. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. Daddy, he just made a mistake." Elijah squirmed in her arms and looked at her, his dark brown eyes filled with determination. "I want to see him." Sarah froze. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the moment the boys would demand answers she couldn't give. She wanted to protect them from the pain she knew would come, but she also knew they deserved to know the truth. "I don't know if we can see Daddy," Sarah whispered, "but maybe we can try." That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Elijah's words echoed in her mind. I want to see him." She knew that ignoring their request would only make things worse. With a sigh, she pulled out a pen and began to write. Dear David, the boys have been asking about you. They want to meet you. I know things didn't end well between us, but they deserve to know who their father is. Please consider meeting them. She hesitated for a moment, then added, They're your sons, David. They need you. Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it into an envelope. Her hands shook as she sealed it. This was her last attempt at reaching David, her final hope that he might change his mind. The next morning, she took the boys to the post office. They watched with wide eyes as she dropped the letter into the mailbox. "When will Daddy get it?" Elijah asked eagerly. "Soon," Sarah whispered, though uncertainty gnawed at her heart. "If he even reads it." Days turned into weeks, and every time the mailman came, Elijah ran to the mailbox, hoping for a letter from his father, but the mailbox remained empty. Sarah tried to distract the boys with trips to the park and movie nights, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that grew with each passing day. What if David never responded? How would she explain that to the boys? One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Elijah asked the question she had been dreading. "Mommy, what if Daddy doesn't want to see us?" Sarah's heart clenched. She forced a smile, even though the pain in her chest was unbearable. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she said softly, "but that doesn't mean they don't love you." "Do you think Daddy loves us?" Isaiah asked quietly. Sarah swallowed hard. I think he's just scared." The boys seemed to accept her answer for now, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before they asked again, and when they did, she wasn't sure if she'd have the strength to lie. A month passed, and still no letter came. The boys stopped asking about the mail, but Sarah could see the disappointment in their eyes. They were trying to be brave, but the absence of a father weighed heavily on them. One afternoon, Sarah received a text from her lawyer. David filed for full custody of his belongings. He doesn't want to contest custody of the children. The words felt like a punch to the gut. David didn't just abandon them. He was making it official. Sarah sat on the floor of the nursery that night, clutching the DNA report in one hand and the lawyer's message in the other. She wanted to scream, to rage, to break something. But instead, she sat in silence, the weight of her grief too heavy to bear. "Mommy?" Elijah's small voice broke through the silence. He stood in the doorway, clutching his teddy bear. "Are you sad?" Sarah wiped her tears and forced a smile. "No, baby, I'm just tired." Elijah crawled into her lap and rested his head against her chest. "I love you, Mommy." Sarah kissed the top of his head, tears streaming down her face. "I love you too, baby. So much." In that moment, she realized something important. She didn't need David to be happy. She had her boys, and that was enough, or at least she hoped it would be. Weeks passed in an uneasy silence. Elijah noticed the change in his mother, her tired smiles, the way she hugged them just a bit tighter, as if afraid she might lose them too. But despite everything, his determination to meet his father only grew stronger. One morning, Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor with a sheet of paper in front of him. His brothers, Isaiah and Noah, sat beside him, their little heads peeking over his shoulder. "What are you doing, Elijah?" Isaiah asked. "I'm going to write Daddy another letter," Elijah whispered. His brow furrowed in concentration as he gripped a crayon in his small hand. "Mommy already did that," Noah pointed out. "She wrote it like a grown-up," Elijah said confidently. "This one's from us." Together, the boys took turns scribbling a heartfelt message to their father, each of them contributing in their own clumsy way. Dear Daddy, we are Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah. We are your kids. We know you haven't seen us, but we really want to meet you. We are good boys, and we love you already. Isaiah added a drawing of the three of them holding hands with a stick figure labeled Dad, while Noah colored in the sun shining above them. Elijah finished the letter with, "Please, Daddy, will you come see us?" They folded the letter and found an envelope. With Sarah busy in the kitchen, the boys quietly snuck the letter into her purse, hoping she would mail it without noticing. Elijah bit his lip nervously, wondering if his plan would work. A few days later, Sarah pulled the envelope from her bag as she sorted through her things. She paused, recognizing the handwriting, and her heart sank when she realized what the boys had done. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes as she unfolded the letter and read their innocent words. She wanted to protect them from the inevitable heartbreak, but how could she deny them the chance, slim as it was? What if David really did answer this time? With a deep sigh, she sealed the envelope and took it to the mailbox herself. The letter arrived at David's house 2 days later. He was in the middle of sorting through the day's mail when he saw the envelope addressed in childish handwriting. His heart skipped a beat. He stared at the letter for a long moment, his hands frozen in place. A mix of emotions surged through him: curiosity, guilt, fear. He knew who the letter was from, even without opening it. Just as David reached for the envelope, his wife, Rachel, appeared in the doorway. "What's that?" she asked, noticing his hesitation. David hesitated, debating whether to tell her the truth. But before he could answer, Rachel snatched the letter from his hands. "Give it back," David said quietly, trying to mask the anxiety in his voice. Rachel scanned the front of the envelope, her eyes narrowing. "This is from them, isn't it?" David shifted uncomfortably. "They're my kids too, Rachel." Rachel's jaw tightened. "You promised we wouldn't open that door again. We moved on, remember?" David clenched his fists at his sides, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I just want to read it." "No," Rachel said firmly. "You read that letter, and it'll drag you back into a mess we've already escaped from." With a flick of her wrist, Rachel crumpled the envelope and tossed it into the trash. David stared at the crushed letter, anger and regret warring within him. But as always, fear won. He said nothing as Rachel left the room, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor like the echo of a door slamming shut behind him. That night, David lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the weight of his past pressed down on him. He thought about the boys, children he had never met but knew were out there. He imagined their faces, their tiny hands reaching for a father they had never known. Rachel's words haunted him, but so did the guilt that had gnawed at him for years. He had tried to bury it, convincing himself that he had done the right thing by walking away. But the letter, though unread, refused to let him forget. His mind drifted to the stories he had heard growing up, whispers about his great-grandfather, a man who had kept his African-American heritage a secret to survive in a world that wouldn't accept him. David had never paid much attention to those stories before, but now they took on a new significance. What if the triplets' skin color wasn't a mistake? What if it wasn't Sarah's fault at all? The thought both terrified and intrigued him. The next morning, David made a decision. He needed to know the truth. David spent the next few days diving into his family history. He called his mother, pretending to be curious about old stories. "Mom, do you remember anything about Grandpa's side of the family? Wasn't there a rumor about—" "About what?" his mother asked cautiously. David hesitated. "About someone passing for white." His mother went silent for a moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "It's not something we ever talked about, David. Times were different back then. People did what they had to do." "So it's true?" David asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "Your great-grandfather was black. He married a white woman and started a new life. He wanted his kids to have a chance, so he made sure no one knew." David sat back, stunned. The pieces began to click into place: the boy's skin, Sarah's protests of innocence, and his own blind anger. The truth had been in his blood all along. Armed with the knowledge of his heritage, David felt the weight of his guilt more heavily than ever. He had abandoned his children out of fear and ignorance, just as his ancestors had been forced to hide who they were. But now, knowing the truth, he couldn't ignore the boys any longer. That evening, David sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he pulled out a sheet of paper. He took a deep breath and began to write. Dear Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah, I'm sorry. I should have been there for you. I made a mistake, one I can never take back, but I want to meet you. I want to get to know you, if you'll let me. David paused, then added, You deserve to know your father. He folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope, determined to send it before fear could stop him again. David sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared at the entrance of the park where the meeting was supposed to happen, where he would see his sons for the first time. His heart pounded as if it might break through his chest. The triplets were out there somewhere with Sarah, waiting for him. The letter had been well received. Elijah himself had sent a short but excited reply, telling David the time and place to meet them. Saturday at 3 p.m., near the playground by the big oak tree. David had planned everything in his head. He would walk up to them, introduce himself, and maybe, if he was lucky, get to hug them. But now that the moment had arrived, fear gripped him tighter than ever. What if they hated him? What if Sarah wouldn't let him anywhere near them? Worse, what if the boys were disappointed by who he really was? He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, at the man who had spent 10 years running from his own blood. His pulse quickened and doubt swirled like a storm inside him. On the other side of the park, Sarah kept glancing at her phone, her heart sinking with every passing minute. Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah were on the playground, their eyes scanning the crowd for the man they had only known in stories and photographs. Is he coming, Mommy? Elijah asked hopefully. I don't know, sweetheart, Sarah whispered, forcing a smile. Maybe he got caught in traffic. But, in her heart, she knew the truth. David might not show up. Not because he didn't care, but because fear had always ruled him. He's afraid of facing the past, she thought bitterly. Afraid of being the father they deserve. Back in the car, David's hands trembled on the wheel. He could see the oak tree in the distance, could imagine the boys waiting there with wide, hopeful eyes. But the weight of 10 years of guilt crushed him, making it impossible to move. He glanced at his phone, then at the time on the dashboard. 15 p.m. I can't do this, David whispered, his breath hitching. The shame of his cowardice filled him, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the car. Instead, he shifted the gear into reverse and backed out of the parking lot. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Sarah checked her phone one last time. No messages, no calls. Her stomach twisted with disappointment. She turned toward the boys who sat quietly on a bench beneath the oak tree. Elijah's hopeful expression had faded into confusion. Noah kicked a rock with his shoe, while Isaiah sat with his arms crossed, staring at the ground. Is Daddy coming? Elijah asked, his voice soft with disbelief. Sarah knelt beside him, brushing a curl away from his forehead. I don't know, baby. Maybe something came up. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she didn't know what else to say. She had been prepared for David to disappoint her, but not the boys. He doesn't want us, does he? Noah whispered, his lower lip trembling. Sarah wrapped her arms around him, pulling all 3 boys into a tight embrace. That's not true, she said firmly, though her heart ached with the weight of the lie. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but I promise, this isn't your fault, okay? Elijah nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Maybe he's just scared. Sarah kissed the top of his head. Maybe, she whispered, though part of her wondered if David's fear would ever let him be the father the boys deserved. David sat in his darkened living room, staring at the blank screen of his phone. He had been sitting there for hours, replaying the events of the day in his mind, how he had driven all the way to the park, only to leave without seeing his sons. I blew it, he thought miserably, again. Rachel stood in the doorway, arms folded across her chest. You didn't go, did you? She asked, though she already knew the answer. David shook his head. I wanted to, he whispered. I panicked. Rachel sighed, her frustration evident. What are you so afraid of, David? They're just kids. I know, he said quietly, burying his face in his hands. "I know I let them down. Again." Rachel's voice softened, but there was still a sharp edge to her words. "If you don't fix this soon, they're going to stop waiting for you." David closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent 10 years running from the truth, and now he was out of time. If he didn't act soon, he would lose his sons forever. At bedtime that night, Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His heart ached with disappointment, but a tiny flicker of hope remained. He knew his father hadn't shown up today, but something deep inside him told him not to give up. He rolled over and nudged Isaiah, who was curled up on the other side of the bed. "Hey," Elijah whispered, "we should try again." Isaiah blinked sleepily. "Try what?" "Writing Daddy another letter," Elijah said, his voice determined. "Maybe if we tell him how much we want to see him, he'll come next time." Isaiah frowned. "But what if he doesn't?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Then at least we'll know we tried." The next morning, Elijah woke early and found a fresh sheet of paper. He carefully wrote another letter, this one shorter and more personal than the first. "Dear Daddy, we waited for you at the park today, but you didn't come. That's okay. We still want to meet you. Please come next time. We love you. Love, Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah." He showed the letter to his brothers, who nodded in agreement. Together, they folded the letter and gave it to Sarah. "What's this?" she asked, glancing at the paper. "Another letter for Daddy," Elijah said quietly. "Can you send it?" Sarah hesitated, her heart aching for her boys. She knew the odds were slim that David would respond, but she also knew she couldn't stand in the way of their hope. With a heavy heart, she sealed the letter and took it to the post office. When David received the second letter, something inside him shifted. He read the words over and over, imagining the boys sitting in the park, waiting for a father who never came. His heart ached with regret. He knew this was his last chance to make things right before it was too late. That night, he sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as he wrote a letter of his own. Dear Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah, I'm so sorry I didn't come. I was scared, but that's not an excuse. I want to see you. I'll be at the park next Saturday. I promise. He paused for a moment, then added, and this time I won't run. David sealed the letter and placed it in the mailbox, hoping, praying that it wasn't too late. The sun shone brightly over the park the following Saturday, casting soft shadows beneath the towering oak tree. Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah stood hand in hand, scanning the crowd with hopeful eyes. Sarah sat on a bench nearby, her heart in her throat, bracing for the possibility of another disappointment. What if he doesn't come again? The thought haunted her, but she said nothing, unwilling to crush the boy's fragile hope. This time, Elijah was the first to spot him, a tall, nervous man stepping out of a silver sedan at the edge of the parking lot. He looked exactly like the photos Sarah had shown them, though his face was drawn with guilt and uncertainty. "Mommy, it's him!" Elijah shouted, his heart leaping. He tugged his brother's hands and pointed. "That's Daddy!" Sarah followed her son's gaze, her stomach twisting as she saw David standing there, hesitating by his car. For a brief moment, she thought he might turn around again. But then, slowly, painfully, he started walking toward them. The boys released each other's hands and bolted toward him. David watched as 3 small figures came racing toward him. His heart pounded wildly. The closer they got, the clearer their faces became, tiny versions of him, with Sarah's smile and eyes full of hope. "Daddy!" Elijah cried, flinging himself into David's arms. David knelt on the grass, catching his son in an embrace that knocked the wind out of him. Isaiah and Noah followed, wrapping their arms around his neck. The 3 of them clung to him with all the force of 10 years of longing, and David felt something in him break, something he had kept locked away for too long. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, boys." "You came," Elijah whispered, his small arms squeezing tighter. "You really came." David nodded, tears streaming down his face as he held them close. "I'll never leave you again," he promised. "I swear." From the bench, Sarah watched the reunion unfold with a swirl of emotions: relief, anger, and something that felt like hope. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to feel. David met her gaze over the boys' heads, his expression heavy with guilt. Slowly, he stood, still holding Elijah's hand as he walked toward her. "Sarah," he began, his voice low and unsteady. "Thank you. Thank you for letting me see them." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I didn't do it for you." David nodded, accepting her words without protest. "I know," he whispered, "but I'm here now, and I want to make things right." Sarah crossed her arms, keeping her voice cool. "You can't just walk back into their lives and expect everything to be okay." "I know," David admitted, his gaze dropping to the ground. "But I'm going to try. I have to." Elijah tugged on David's sleeve, his brown eyes bright with hope. "Can Daddy stay with us, Mommy?" Sarah hesitated. She had spent so long shielding her sons from David's absence that she wasn't sure how to let him back in. But the look on Elijah's face, and the way David's hands trembled with regret, made the decision for her. "You can stay for today," Sarah said slowly. "But only today." David gave a small, grateful nod. "That's all I'm asking." The hours passed quickly as David spent the day with his sons, playing games and answering their endless questions. They asked him about his job, his favorite foods, and whether he knew how to ride a bike. David smiled through the pain of lost years, soaking up every moment with them. For the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. At one point, Noah climbed onto his lap and whispered, "Do you love us, Daddy?" David's heart clenched. He cupped Noah's face in his hands and kissed his forehead. "With all my heart," he whispered. "I always have. I just didn't know how to show it." Isaiah, usually the quietest of the three, looked up from the ground. "Will you come back next time?" David's throat tightened. "I promise," he whispered, brushing a curl away from Isaiah's forehead. "I'll come back, every time." As the sun began to set, Sarah stood by the car watching David say goodbye to the boys. Elijah clung to his father's leg, his face crumpling with emotion. "Do you really have to go?" Elijah asked, his voice cracking. David knelt and gathered all three boys into a tight hug. "I have to go now," he said softly, "but I'll see you again soon. I promise." The boys sniffled but nodded, accepting his words with the faith only children could have. David stood slowly, turning towards Sarah. "Thank you," he whispered again, "for today." Sarah gave a stiff nod. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she warned quietly. David's gaze was steady. "I won't." That night, after putting the boys to bed, Sarah sat on the couch, lost in thought. The day had gone better than she expected, but the fear of getting hurt again gnawed at her. Could David really be trusted? Or was this just another moment of guilt that would fade in time? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from David. David. "Thank you again, Sarah. I meant what I said. I'll be there for them, and if you'll let me, I'll make things right with you too." Sarah stared at the message, her emotions a tangled mess. She wanted to believe him, but trust was a fragile thing, one that had been broken too many times. Still, something deep inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, people could change. She set the phone down and closed her eyes, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: hope. David arrived at Sarah's house the following weekend, just as he promised. His hands shook as he knocked on the door, unsure of the reception he would receive. A part of him still feared that Sarah might slam the door in his face. But instead, the door swung open, and Elijah stood there, his face lighting up with a smile. "You came!" Elijah shouted, turning back toward his brothers. "He's here! Daddy's here!" Isaiah and Noah appeared behind Elijah, their excitement barely contained. David knelt and opened his arms as they barreled into him, giggling. The weight of their joy made his heart ache with both relief and regret. Sarah appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. She wasn't smiling, but she gave him a small, cautious nod. "You're early," she said. David straightened, brushing his hands on his jeans. I wanted to make sure I was here on time. I know what it means to them. Sarah gave a non-committal hum. They've been asking all morning if you'd show up. David glanced at his sons, who were watching him with adoring eyes. His heart squeezed. I won't let them down again, he said quietly. Sarah met his gaze for a long moment, then stepped aside. Come on in. The first hour was tense. David sat stiffly on the couch while the boys eagerly showed him their toys. Sarah hovered in the background, not quite sure what to do with herself. It was strange to have David in their home after so many years. At first, their conversation was stilted. Small talk about the weather, the boys' favorite cartoons, and school activities. But slowly, the tension began to thaw. David joined the boys on the floor, helping them build a block tower. Elijah's laughter filled the room when David pretended to be a giant, knocking the tower down with exaggerated roars. Sarah watched from the kitchen, her arms crossed over her chest. The boys' happiness was undeniable, but doubt still gnawed at her. Was this real? Or was it just another fleeting moment that would leave them heartbroken again? Later that afternoon, while the boys were occupied in the living room, Sarah made tea for herself and David. He followed her into the kitchen, leaning awkwardly against the counter. Thank you for letting me come, David said. It means a lot. Sarah handed him a mug, her expression guarded. Don't thank me yet. It's going to take more than a few visits to fix what's broken. David nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. I know. He hesitated, then added softly, I've been doing a lot of thinking, Sarah, about what happened, about everything I got wrong. Sarah's jaw tightened. You mean everything you ran away from? David flinched, but he didn't argue. Yeah, he admitted. I was scared. I thought I could just walk away and start over, but it was a mistake, one I'll regret for the rest of my life. Sarah's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. It wasn't just me you hurt, David. It was them. I know, David whispered, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, I swear. In the weeks that followed, David made good on his promise. He showed up every weekend, taking the boys to the park, attending their school events, and helping them with their homework. The boys began to trust him, their bond with their father growing stronger with each passing day. Elijah loved playing soccer with David, while Isaiah enjoyed reading stories together. Noah, ever mischievous, delighted in playing pranks on him, giggling when David pretended to be surprised. But for Sarah, things weren't so simple. Watching David with the boys stirred up old wounds, memories of the man she had loved and lost. Some nights she lay awake wondering if she could ever truly forgive him. One Saturday afternoon, after David had taken the boys to the park, he returned to find Sarah sitting on the porch, waiting for him. She looked tired but resolute, as if she had finally made up her mind about something. Can we talk? She asked. David nodded, sitting beside her. Of course. Sarah took a deep breath, bracing herself. I need to know why you really left. Her voice was steady, but her hands fidgeted in her lap. I deserve the truth, David. Not just for me, but for them. David ran a hand through his hair, his expression heavy with regret. I was scared, he admitted quietly. When they were born, I saw their skin, and all I could think was that you'd betrayed me. It wasn't rational, it wasn't fair, but I let fear take over. Sarah swallowed hard. And now? David met her gaze, his eyes filled with sincerity. Now I know better. I've learned things about my family, things I didn't know before. Sarah's brow furrowed. What do you mean? David took a deep breath. My great-grandfather was black. He passed as white to escape the racism of his time, and no one ever talked about it. But the truth was always there, buried in our blood. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. So, the boys? They were never the result of betrayal, David whispered. They're a part of me, just like you. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, and for the first time in years, the weight of anger and betrayal began to lift from her heart. She nodded slowly, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for telling me. David reached for her hand, his touch hesitant but hopeful. I want to build something real this time, Sarah. Not just with the boys, but with you too, if you'll let me." Sarah looked down at their hands, the warmth of his touch stirring something deep inside her. It wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal and trust to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. "I don't know what the future holds," she whispered. "But maybe we can try." David smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd really like that." The next few weeks were both challenging and revealing as David and Sarah navigated the complexities of co-parenting. For the first time in 10 years, David began to participate in the day-to-day responsibilities of raising the boys. At first, the routines overwhelmed him. Homework, meal prep, bedtime tantrums. But he persisted. One Friday afternoon, David arrived to pick up the boys for an outing, only to find Sarah struggling to get Isaiah ready. The quietest of the triplets, Isaiah had refused to put on his shoes and sat stubbornly on the floor, arms crossed. "I don't want to go," Isaiah whispered. "What if Daddy leaves again?" David's heart broke at the words, but he knelt beside Isaiah, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I know I let you down before," David said softly, "but I promise I'm not going anywhere. Not this time." Isaiah hesitated, glancing toward Sarah, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, Isaiah slipped his small hand into David's. "You ready now, buddy?" David asked with a smile. Isaiah gave a shy nod, his grip tightening. "Okay, Daddy." David wanted to do more than just make amends. He wanted to create new memories with his boys. One Saturday, he surprised them by taking them fishing, something his own father used to do with him as a child. Elijah was the most enthusiastic, peppering David with questions about fish and bait. Isaiah was content to sit quietly by the water's edge while Noah giggled each time he cast his fishing line too far and tangled it in the bushes. Sarah watched from the shore, her heart softening as she saw David interact with their children. The sound of their laughter echoed across the lake, and for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Meanwhile, David's new relationship with his sons was causing tension in his marriage with Rachel. She had been increasingly distant, and one evening, after David returned home from a weekend with the boys, Rachel confronted him. "You're spending too much time with them," she said coldly. David stared at her, stunned. "They're my kids, Rachel. I can't ignore them." "And what about us?" Rachel demanded. "What about the life we were building?" David shook his head, anger simmering beneath the surface. "That life was built on lies. I abandoned my sons once. I won't do it again." Rachel's expression hardened. "Then maybe you don't belong here anymore." The words hit David like a punch to the gut, but he knew she was right. The man he was becoming, the father his boys needed, couldn't exist in the life he had built with Rachel. That night, David packed his things and left. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was running away. He was running toward something better. As winter approached, David and Sarah decided to spend Christmas together for the first time since the boys were born. It wasn't an easy decision. Both of them still had scars from the past, but they agreed that the boys deserved to experience the joy of the holidays with both parents. On Christmas morning, the house was filled with laughter and excitement as the boys tore into their presents. David sat beside Sarah on the couch, sipping hot cocoa and watching the triplets play with their new toys. For a brief moment, it felt like they were a family again. Sarah glanced at David, and for the first time in years, she smiled. Really smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being here." David reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll always be here. I promise." In the weeks following Christmas, the walls between David and Sarah slowly began to crumble. They spent more time together, not just as co-parents, but as friends. The conversations they had avoided for years finally surfaced, and with each one, they chipped away at the resentment that had built up between them. One evening, after the boys had gone to bed, David and Sarah sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets and sharing a bottle of wine. The night was quiet, and for the first time, the weight of the past felt lighter. "I've been holding on to so much anger," Sarah admitted softly, "but it's not helping anyone, least of all the boys." David nodded, his expression solemn. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Sarah, but I'll keep working for it. Every day." Sarah looked at him, her heart full, but no longer heavy. "I forgive you," she whispered, and in that moment, something inside both of them finally healed. As spring blossomed, David and Sarah fell into an easy rhythm, their relationship transforming into something deeper. Not quite the romance they once had, but something stronger. They weren't just co-parents anymore. They were partners in every sense of the word. The boys flourished under their new family dynamic, their confidence growing with each passing day. Elijah became the captain of his soccer team. Isaiah excelled in reading, and Noah's mischievous streak earned him a reputation as the class clown. Through it all, David and Sarah stood by their sons, cheering them on at every turn. The boys' school held an end-of-year ceremony, and both David and Sarah were in attendance. As the triplets took the stage to accept an award for academic excellence, David felt a lump form in his throat. When the principal handed Elijah the microphone to say a few words, the boy beamed. "I want to thank my mom and dad," Elijah said, his voice clear and steady, "for always being there for us." David's heart swelled with pride. After the ceremony, he stood with the boys for a family photo, Sarah by his side. In that moment, surrounded by love and laughter, he knew they had finally built something real. With the school year behind them, David, Sarah, and the boys took a trip to the lake, a place where they could leave the past behind and focus on the future. They spent the day fishing, swimming, and making new memories. As the sun began to set, David pulled Sarah aside, his heart pounding. "I know we've been through a lot," he said softly, "but I'd like to build a future with you, not just for the boys, for us." Sarah smiled, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I'd like that too," she whispered. Months later, the boys' biological grandparents, David's estranged parents, reached out, hoping to make amends. With David's encouragement, Sarah agreed to meet with them, giving them the chance to rebuild what had been lost. The reunion was emotional, filled with tears and apologies. Though it would take time to rebuild trust, it was a step in the right direction, a step toward healing. On the triplets' 10th birthday, David made a final promise to his sons. "No matter what happens," he said, holding them close, "I will always be here for you, always." Elijah, Isaiah, and Noah grinned, their eyes shining with joy. "We know, Daddy," Elijah whispered. "We love you." David glanced at Sarah, who stood beside him, smiling through her tears. "We love you too," she whispered. In that moment, David knew he had finally found what he had spent so long searching for, a family, built not just on blood, but on love, forgiveness, and the promise of a better future. The summer that followed was unlike any the Turner family had ever experienced. For the first time, there was peace, laughter, and love in abundance. The tension that had once weighed on David and Sarah was replaced with a growing sense of belonging, not just between them, but between the boys and their extended family as well. David's parents, now eager to make amends, began visiting regularly. The boys, who had never known their grandparents before, embraced them with open hearts. Isaiah, in particular, grew close to David's father, spending hours listening to stories about their family history. It became a chance to reclaim their identity, one that had been hidden for generations. "Grandpa," Isaiah asked one afternoon, "why didn't we know about your great-grandpa being black?" David's father sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "It was a different time, son. People made choices out of fear of not being accepted." Isaiah furrowed his brow. "But we're not scared anymore." The old man smiled, his eyes misty. "No, we're not." Not. And that's what matters. The boys nodded solemnly, as if understanding that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. The truth had set them free, and now they were ready to carry their legacy forward. Sarah and David found that co-parenting evolved into something more natural, more supportive. They divided responsibilities evenly without conflict, taking the boys to soccer practice, hosting sleepovers, and attending parent-teacher conferences together. David had also moved into a small apartment nearby, ensuring he could be an active part of the boys' everyday lives, without disrupting the rhythm Sarah had built. Slowly but surely, the wounds between them continued to heal. One night, after a family dinner, David and Sarah sat on the back porch, watching the boys chase fireflies in the yard. "You've come a long way," Sarah said softly, glancing at David. "So have you," David replied with a small smile. Sarah sipped her drink, then gave him a sidelong glance. "Do you ever think we'll get back to where we were?" David hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't think we need to go back, Sarah. I think maybe we can build something new, better." She gave him a thoughtful nod, and for the first time, the future didn't seem so uncertain. The boys continued to thrive. Elijah had blossomed into a talented soccer player, and his team had made it to the district finals. On game day, the entire family, including David's parents, came to cheer him on. David sat in the front row, nerves buzzing through him as he watched his eldest son take the field. He thought about all the moments he had missed, Elijah's first steps, his first words. But now, he was determined not to miss anything ever again. When Elijah scored the winning goal in the final minutes, the crowd erupted. David jumped to his feet, cheering louder than anyone else. Elijah looked up from the field, and their eyes met. The boy grinned, lifting his arms in triumph. In that moment, David knew he had earned a place in his sons' lives, not just as a visitor, but as a father. As David rebuilt his relationship with the boys, Sarah found herself rediscovering who she was beyond motherhood. For so long, she had poured everything into raising her sons, but now she felt ready to focus on her own dreams. She enrolled in a few online courses, dusting off the career ambitions she had set aside when her world fell apart years ago. She even started dating again, tentatively at first, though she was surprised by how supportive David was. "I just want you to be happy," David told her one evening after she mentioned her new relationship. His words were genuine, and for the first time, there were no traces of resentment between them. Sarah smiled. "I want that for you too." Though David and Sarah had moved beyond their romantic past, David wasn't done healing. He still carried the weight of regret, not just for what he had done to Sarah, but for how long he had let fear control him. Determined to become the best version of himself, David began therapy, something he never would have considered before. He spent months unpacking his emotions, confronting the shame he had buried for so long, and learning how to forgive himself. It wasn't easy, but David emerged stronger, more confident, and more certain of who he wanted to be. As the boys' 11th birthday approached, David wanted to plan something special, a surprise that would show them just how much he loved them. He spent weeks organizing a camping trip, complete with fishing, hiking, and a surprise bonfire at night. Sarah helped him keep the plan a secret, and when the boys found out on the morning of their birthday, their excitement was contagious. "Best birthday ever!" Noah shouted as they loaded their gear into the car. That night, as they sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows, Elijah turned to his father with a thoughtful expression. "Daddy, are you happy now?" David smiled, his heart full. "I am," he said, "and it's because of you boys. You've made me the happiest I've ever been." One day, as the family gathered for a summer barbecue, David's father pulled him aside. The two men sat on the porch, sipping lemonade as they watched the boys play in the yard. "I was wrong, you know," David's father said quietly. "I thought I was protecting you by hiding the truth about our family, but all I did was pass my fear down to you." David nodded, understanding now in a way he hadn't before. "I don't want my boys to carry that fear," he said. "They deserve better." His father smiled, his eyes glinting with pride. And you've given them that. You've broken the cycle. For the first time, David felt at peace with his past. Later that evening, as the family gathered around the table for dinner, Sarah stood to make a toast. She looked around at the people who had become her world, her boys, her parents, David, and even his parents. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you all for being here, for being part of our story. It hasn't always been easy, but we've come a long way, and I know that no matter what happens, we'll always have each other." The table erupted in applause, and as David raised his glass to her, their eyes met across the table. In that moment, they knew they had built something real, something that would last. As the sun set on their perfect evening, David, Sarah, and the boys sat on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight. There were no more doubts, no more regrets, just the quiet peace of knowing they had made it through the hardest parts and come out stronger on the other side. Elijah leaned against his father's shoulder, his voice soft but content. "We're really lucky, aren't we?" David smiled, wrapping his arm around his son. "Yes, we are." And in that moment, David knew the truth. He had found everything he had been searching for, not in the life he had once tried to build, but in the family he had finally learned to cherish. The story doesn't end there, because life never truly ends. There will be challenges, arguments, and hard days ahead. But now, they will face those challenges together, as a family. As David and Sarah tuck the boys into bed that night, Elijah looks up at his father one last time. "You'll be here in the morning, right?" David leans down, kisses his son's forehead, and whispers, "Always." And this time, he means it. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Think about your relationships. Is there someone you could forgive or reconnect with? Follow us for more uplifting stories about second chances and transformation. Join the conversation by sharing your reflections. Your story could inspire others. Remember, every day is a chance to start fresh.